Hi, you're listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast.
We provide relevant resources to new and aspiring independent school leaders to help you grow, succeed at work, and have a positive impact on the lives of students.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Matt.
On this podcast, we have insightful conversations with leaders from across all areas of independent school education. Our guests today are Dr. Robert Evans and Dr. Michael Thompson. Dr. Evans is a psychologist and school consultant. A former high school and preschool teacher and a former child and family therapist, he has consulted to more than 1,700 schools, including 700 NAIS schools. He served for nearly 40 years as executive director of the Human Relations Service, a nonprofit mental health agency in Wellesley, Massachusetts. Evans' interests are in leadership, helping schools manage change, improving adult relationships within schools, and crisis intervention. He is the author of many articles and 3 books, including 7 Secrets of the Savvy School Leader, A Guide to Surviving and Thriving, and The Human Side of School Change. Evans is an independent school graduate, and his children and grandchildren have all attended independent schools. Dr. Michael Thompson is a clinical psychologist, author, and school consultant. He has worked in schools for 50 years, starting out as a middle school teacher and later training as a counselor and psychologist. Now the supervising psychologist for the Belmont Hill School, he has worked with more than 700 schools in the United States, Asia, Africa, Europe, and Central America. In addition, he served as the longtime facilitator for the NAIS Institute for New Heads and later for the Academy of International School Heads. He has also served on the board of the American Camp Association. Thompson is the author or co-author of 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Raising Cain, Protecting the Emotional Life of Boys, and Best Friends, Worst Enemies, Understanding the Social Lives of Children. Like Evans, Thompson attended independent schools, as did his children and grandchildren. Here is our conversation with Robert Evans and Michael Thompson.
Hi, Robert and Michael. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. Welcome to the Full Stack Educator Podcast.
Thank you. We're happy to be here.
Well, as you know, our listeners are new and aspiring independent school leaders. And we would love to start by asking you both to briefly share your career journey and your work within independent schools.
I started out as a middle school teacher in public schools 50 years ago. I'm 73 and I started as a teacher, middle school social studies teacher at the age of 23, then later retrained as a counselor, and then later retrained as a clinical psychologist. But I never could leave schools. I always, even when I had a private practice, I always had one foot in education, and I've always been fascinated by school leadership. And I think the thing that sealed the deal was I was a facilitator for the National Association of Independent Schools Institute for New Heads for 10 years and met 500 new heads heading into their first jobs. And then I left that and was for 14 years the facilitator for the Academy of International School Heads, which performed the same function for heads in the international school world. So I've known a lot of school leaders, in probably over 1,500 at this point, and I've never aspired to do the job, but I have a tremendous interest in supporting and helping school leaders think through the challenges that they face.
How about you, Rob?
So I too have been in schools for 50 years, but I started at the age of 10, so I'm much younger than Michael. Actually, I'm older than Michael. I started as a high school English teacher in suburban Boston. And then when I went back to grad school and found my way into psychology, I taught preschool for a couple of years. I spent 4 decades at a nonprofit children and family mental health clinic and eventually became the executive director there and did tons of child and family counseling. And like Michael, I always kept a foot in the school world. It's always been like home to me. And I've consulted one way or another in 1,700 different schools, public and private. And I've done lots of work with the with boards, with trustees, with governance issues, but especially with schools that have been grappling with implementing change and innovation and the kind of resistance that often inspires. And like Michael, he and I have each done separately and together lots of crisis intervention in schools after big, challenging, difficult things happen, deaths, suicides, even murders, sexual abuse scandals, financial blow-ups, and other sorts of things. So like Michael, I've long been interested in what I think of as the adult issues in school, meaning the dynamics of a faculty and an administration together, and also the dynamics between a school and its families.
Rob and I just during the pandemic wrote a book called Hopes and Fears, working with today's independent school parent, and NAIS published it last week. Just had to get that in there.
Absolutely. And that's, in fact, what we want to talk to you guys about today. So you just released this book, and it focuses on the relationship between parents and schools. You know, as you well know, the home and school relationship sets a tone for the entire student's experience within the school for however long that they're there. And we want to talk with you a little bit more about that and unpack that. But let's first answer this question. Why do parents choose independent schools?
We say at the beginning of Hopes and Fears that it's the hopes and fears of parents that have driven independent schools. It's the reason they're there. Parents who have the means often want a particular kind of setting in which their child can learn, in which their child's strengths are seen and are actualized, in which their child has relationships with teachers that are very close. Every child known, every child loved, right? That's what an independent school parent wants. But an independent school parent is also likely to be driven by the fears of what might not happen for their child in a public school setting, even though they live in a good suburban district. They may think my child will get lost, my child won't be close to teachers, my child won't get into the school musical. And so it's this combination of their hopes for what might happen and their fears about what might happen, which send parents to independent schools.
So, in your book, you dedicate a good portion of the beginning of the book to exploring the rising tide of parental anxiety. And so I'm curious, maybe Rob, could you talk about why understanding parent anxiety is important?
Yes. So first, when you listen to independent school teachers talk about their difficulties in communicating with parents, what you often hear is a combination of fear and apprehension and anxiety, and oftentimes a kind of implicit criticism because teachers are scared of or afraid about, worried about, or sometimes angry at those parents who take them on in ways or put them through paces they don't want to go through and so on. And one of the things Michael and I have been convinced of for a long time now is that even parents who sometimes start out in a sort of a hostile or condescending or dismissive or angry way, if you just stay with the conversation a little, it turns out often that they're quite anxious. And what they're anxious about is not just schooling, but it's more broadly the context within which their child raising is happening. So, for example, Michael, 20 years ago, if you were sending a child of yours to independent school, the prospect of her or him becoming a lawyer or a doctor would have been appealing. And it may still be for many people, but it's nowhere near as appealing as it once was. Large numbers of lawyers, newly minted, say it wasn't worth the law school tuition. Large numbers of physicians don't want their own children to become physicians. Doctors have a suicide rate which is twice the national average. The stress levels are very high for people in the medical profession. And the reward levels are much lower, in part because they're constantly overwhelmed by red tape and insurance forms and bureaucratic and regulatory stuff and so on. But the larger context here is that it used to be easier to be confident that admission to a good independent school would lead to admission to a good college and onto a good career in life. And while that still applies for many, it doesn't apply for nearly as many. When Michael and I, who are both older than the two of you, when we were finishing up at the respective independent schools we went to and applying to Ivy League colleges, the Ivy League was taking almost 2 out of 3. The reason in part was that access was low and unfair. They were only looking at the graduates of secondary independent schools and elite public schools. But anxiety was also low. And if Michael and I had not wished to go to college, it was possible then, in fact, not that hard, to find a blue-collar job with lifetime employment and a steadily rising wage. And today, all that has flipped. The elite colleges are taking 4 out of 100. There are no blue-collar jobs like that left. And lots of parents, even those who are doing well right now, are nowhere near as confident about what the future holds for their own kids. So when they choose an independent school and start paying tuition, many of them have in the background a kind of permanent anxiety about where this is going to end up. Many independent schools, for example, right now report that when a student is in the last year, so 8th grade for a pre-K through 8 school, or 12th grade for a pre-K through 12th or whatever, they will hear from parents, if she doesn't get into X next year, this will have been a waste. Not, this was wonderful, and we want her to get into X, but this was the pathway to X. No school wants to be the pathway to X, right?
Right.
Yet if you're the parent in that situation, it's actually understandable that you'd be apprehensive about whether your own child is going to be able to find a beachhead and a career and a life of the kind that you had envisaged. So for Michael and me, our sense, we hear over and over from schools, more and more parents who act as though their tuition dollars are purchasing a service or indeed an outcome, and get very anxious when something, even something small, seems to cast doubt on that.
Wow, that's really interesting. You've referenced many trends there that are kind of surprising but really informative. I'm curious. You spoke about how doctors and lawyers are less likely to want their own children to be doctors and lawyers now, but also that parents are wanting are choosing independent school because they believe that something has to happen for their child to be successful. What is it that they're hoping happens? What is it that they're thinking an independent school is going to provide that sets their kid up for success?
Well, we'll both answer that question. One thing I would say is they're hoping that, in fact, the independent school will help their child be the one who gets through the eye of the needle. Michael, you heard Michael say earlier, Michael Thompson, that is Michael, earlier say that parents often worry that their child will get lost in a public school. When you choose an independent school, one of the things you're typically choosing is smaller school, typically certainly smaller class sizes and a smaller teacher-pupil ratio. And one thing parents are often hoping is that this is going to translate into a chance for their child to shine more. So, for example, my wife and I sent our kids to independent schools, though we live in a very good Boston suburb. And we did it in part because our local high school would have dwarfed them. And what we knew we weren't buying better teachers, to be honest with you, but we were buying a different context for good teachers to succeed with kids. And in our case, we felt it was worth it, actually. But what we didn't want, I have, sons who would never have made a varsity team, but who got to play varsity sports, for example, just to pick one thing.
Yeah.
Who made connections to classroom teachers that 30 years later they still have. So I think that's one of the things anyway, parents. Michael, what do you think?
Did you just hear the satisfied independent school parent there?
Yeah.
Right? His boys got the relationship. with a teacher. So let me give you an example. Parents often ask me when I'm giving kind of my parenting talks, they say, Dr. Thompson, I don't need my child to get into Harvard. I don't need to get him into an Ivy League college. I love sentences that start that way because I always think there's a little self-delusion in it.
Yeah.
But what they say is, I just want my child to have a passion. I really want her to have a passion. And I say, of course you do. How old is your child? Well, she's 11. And I say, and did you have a passion at 11? I turn it right around in the way psychologists do. And they say, well, no, but I'm hoping, if she goes to Sunnybrook by the Sea school, that she'll, the passion will light up early and guide her. They're looking for they're looking for their child to be turned on to education, to be an excited, intrinsic learner. And that's why many independent school parents get so grouchy when their 7th grade boy seems to take his expensive education completely for granted and has no future orientation and no discernible passion except video games. And this drives them up the wall. Many of them come to a sense of wisdom. I have a 7th grader. This is where he is now. Others turn on the teacher and think, why have you not? Right? Why have you not produced a more disciplined, hardworking, inspired, passionate student? That's the return on investment I was hoping for.
So a moment ago, Rob, you talked about anxiety among parents at sort of a macro level. I'm curious, Michael, could you talk a little bit about the factors within a school and sort of the school-parent relationship that either exacerbate or accentuate that parental anxiety?
The parental anxiety starts off the moment you drop a pre-K child at school, because you don't get to watch them all day. In fact, you're turning them over to strangers and putting your child's destiny in the hands of strangers. And you can no longer have the little surveillance camera that you've had in the child's room, right? And the little radio by their bedside. And you have to separate and trust people. And your child doesn't tell you about her pre-K day. Actually, your 2nd grader doesn't tell you much about her day either. And actually, either does your 4th grader. So you're starved of information. You've made this big commitment and you have these big hopes, and your children you ask them, how did it go today, sweetie? And they're saying, fine. It's okay, Mom. And then as they get to be 6th and 7th grade, they say, it's okay, Mom. In this really annoyed, why are you asking me again? way. We got a father who was laughing at that, right? Because this is this is the universal experience of parents. But the kids, their predictable developmental challenges with kids, and is my child in 1st grade able to make a friend? Is she reading at the speed that the other children are reading at? If she's not, is that worrisome? Is my teacher not telling me that there's a reading problem here? When will I know? And you can, at every developmental stage, and again, the 7th grade boy and the undermotivated 10th grade boy, or the 11th grade boy. I work at a boys' school, incidentally. The 11th grade boy who thinks he doesn't need to work at his academics because he's going to be a professional athlete, And there are boys at my school who hold on to that dream, and their parents are wringing their hands and rending their garments, because I think that's statistically unlikely, as it is, in fact, because professional sports don't often turn to the independent school world to find their top athletes, right? But the parents have a dream. And it's important that all teachers understand this. The parent has a dream that they may not, in fact, have fleshed out. But when their child hits a developmental snag, or the teacher says, oh, by the way, your child hasn't handed in homework for the last month. You think, oh my God, my dream's in jeopardy. And you can want to do one of two things and say, well, that's curious. My child's hiding their non-homework performance from me. Or you can say to the teacher, why didn't you tell me that sooner? Right? You can go right for the teacher. Why wasn't I told? Why don't I have more control over this situation and the realization of my dream? And that's where the conflict inevitably comes in, because believe it or not, even in independent school, there are kids who are not that crazy about homework.
Yeah, I just thought of something as we were talking about, how anxiety might change throughout the different stages of development of a child. Do you think it helps if, say it's a pre-K through 12 school, if a parent is guided by the school through some of these anxieties when the child is younger, is that going to make a difference when they get into middle school and face different challenges and have different anxieties about their child? No.
Speaking as a father, when the school calls you and tells you that your 8th grade daughter was dancing and grinding at the middle school dance.
Yeah.
There's nothing they could have said to you about your daughter in 4th grade that would have prepared you for that. There are developmental surprises, right?
So the second part of it is this, Matt. There are whole pieces of parenting that you can talk about when you reflect upon it, or at an evening, say at school or whatever. That's completely different from actually getting up every morning with a child and going to bed every night with a child and doing all that. And a tremendous amount of what happens between members of a family, inside the family, happens instantaneously and rapidly and is actually unplannable. People can, over time, with professional help, learn to do some things in a particular way. But it's not at all easy. And a tremendous dilemma that's implicit here is that, first of all, schools have relatively little leverage over parents to begin with, relatively little contact, even though you have more in an independent school than typically in many large public schools. But relatively little sway over all of that, Plus, the non-school lives of kids loom very large in the anxiety equation. So when a student graduates from 12th grade, if you go to that ceremony and you pick the student out, and the moment she or he accepts their diploma, you stop the clock, you go back to the moment of birth, you're looking at about 18 years, give or take a little bit, during which time the kid has been in school 10% of his or her life. 10, not 20 and not 25 and not 30 and not 40. You can assume, as I do, that a good school has a larger impact than the percentage. But what you know for sure is that the largest influences on how a child turns out are not school. It's not that school's unimportant, far from it. None of us would be doing this evening if that were true. Schools are important. But it's also true that there's a tremendous amount of what goes on in the lives of kids and families outside of school that affects, first of all, what happens in school, and second, that affects the attitudes of parents as they come to school. So, for example, parents who have their kids, who spend a lot of money to send their kids to club sports and get special coaches, typically hear a lot of wonderful things about their kids' athletic future from these coaches who are paid a fortune. Then when it turns out the kid actually isn't good enough to make the starting team at school, there's a sudden problem here. It has nothing to do with what the school would normally do. But schools are increasingly finding themselves having to grapple with influences that affect kids and parents over which the school has relatively little control.
Just to add to that, I talked to a head in North Carolina, and he said of his four of his five best boys on his basketball team, 4 families had paid each more than $100,000 to club basketball, AAU club basketball. and their expectations
Wow.
for a Division I,
Scholarship.
were very high. But those weren't Division I kids. They were just parents who could spend $100,000 on their kids' club basketball. And there's a collision there, which then the school coach becomes the focus of the parents' disappointment. And then the head of school has to protect the coach, or the AD has to protect the coach, and the school head has to protect the AD. These things they get very intense. And there's a lot of dream and a lot of money on the line.
And so back to where Michael started you, Matt, hopes and fears.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about anxieties and the different factors that cause those. Let's shift to challenges and what happens when those anxieties start to create challenges for schools in dealing with parents. I'm not sure there's anyone more experienced than you all are with helping schools navigate student and parent challenges. So can you talk to us how you conceptualize those challenges in the book? What sort of framework and taxonomy you present for navigating these challenges?
Well, Rob's already done one, which is that teachers, even in sometimes their fright about the customer, have to remember that parents are anxious because they're amateurs. But what helps teachers is have a clear school policy about the relationship with what parents would be, an administration that makes it clear they're going to back the teacher, and some training for the teachers. Teachers are usually brilliant at communicating with kids. They're not generally very good at handling adult conflict. And if they don't know what the rights of the customer their head of school has to say, this is what we owe to parents and this is what we don't do for parents. We don't hop every time they say hop. But if a head doesn't say anything, every teacher has to make it up in his or her own mind what the relationship is. And the independent schools have embraced recently, recently being the last 20 years, for people Rob's and my age, everything in the last 20 years is recent. I just want to say that. But schools have embraced the parent-school partnership. Matt and Michael, do you know what that means? Do you know what that means in any given school? Oh my God, it's in all the VIEW books now, and there's a parent-school partnership. But teachers live in fear of that because it's undefined. And what is that? What rights does that give the parent? What rights does it give the teacher? It's all vague and euphemistic. And what makes it helpful for teachers is if the leadership of schools spells out how they see the relationship and where the boundaries are for the relationship. And Rob can pick up from that there.
So I've come to be a big believer in the notion that if there's going to be a partnership, we need to be careful not to assume that it implies equality. If we're talking about equality of wanting the best for each student, sure. We're talking about knowing what's best for each student, particularly at school. That's actually not true. The reason people are hired at schools is because they know more about this. It's their job, what they're trained in. And my take has long been, Michael and I talk about this in the book, that the school as an institution and educators as individual people need to be the senior partner in the partnership. So that doesn't mean they condescend or ignore or dismiss or demean or are disrespectful, but it does mean that they know what's what. They know how they do school and they know what's good for kids. And they don't hesitate to say that. So, sometimes schools, in an effort to try to calm anxious customers, if that's how they see their parents, have essentially been trying to run from pillar to post to promise everything and do everything. To hop every time the parent says hop, to use Michael's image of a minute ago. In fact, one of the much better ways to calm anxiety is to act like you know what you're doing. You go to a doctor, you don't want the doctor to be saying, oh gosh, well, maybe it's this, maybe it could be that. Maybe it's You want the doctor to be able to say, actually, it looks like it's this. And if it isn't, then we need to go to a specialist. And even if it's not good news, you want the doctor to know what she's doing or what he's doing.
Yeah.
And too often, teachers as individuals have trouble with this. Michael referred to this a minute ago. I'll elaborate on it. Teachers are hugely, hugely, hugely conflict avoidant. People who spend their lives teaching children in classrooms are typically at their best with children in classrooms. Very few of them have a module in that package that's good at adult conflict. Very, very few. And as they move up the line and become administrators and other things, they get somewhat better at it because they get some practice. But conflict avoidance is endemic in schools in general, independent schools in particular. So what we often have are people who are reluctant to say, no, we do this, but we don't do that. So my notion of the senior partnership would be something like this. Welcome. We're glad to see you. Here's how we do school here, because this is what's good for kids. If this is right for your child, we'd love to have you with us. If not, there are other schools to consider. And to be clear enough to say, instead of we do everything for everybody and we meet every need, we do this and we do it. Most independent schools, in part because they're so small and their classes are small, have actually limitations on what they can provide compared to, say, a large 2,000 pupil public high school. And too often in recent years, they've been promising to heal the sick and raise the dead, even though it's not something they can do. And most independent schools, in fact, have had a hard time recently, Matt, staying with the notion of admitting mission-appropriate families, partially because they've been so concerned about enrollment, because there have been so many places in the country where enrollment's been a challenge, right? So the long and short of all this is that one of the ways you can actually calm anxiety is not just waiting until something happens and then dealing with that family, but starting the relationship out on a basis that says, welcome, we know who we are, here's what you're joining, this is what you can count on from us, this is what we need to count on from you. And when schools do that, what they do is give everybody a chance to sort of relax a little because there's a guiding hand, that's acting in a way to be in charge. It doesn't eliminate everything, but it sure cuts down.
I'm going to give you a quick example of how this plays out. I was at an independent school, and they were presenting a boy to me who probably had multiple diagnoses, certainly probably a pretty severe learning disability, maybe dyslexia, but was also probably on the autism spectrum. And his mother had been beating up the teachers for 3 years, asking them to provide special services that the schools couldn't provide. And because they didn't have the trained people, and they're geographically, they were isolated. They couldn't find the people, but it wasn't, as Rob said, it wasn't their mission. But the mother was determined to attack and berate and persuade and lobby and attack and berate. And she'd been doing it for 3 years. And I heard about this boy all day, but I wasn't really hearing about the boy. I was hearing about the mother and what a burden she had become to the school. Well, I gave a parenting talk that night, and she came up to me afterwards. I recognized the name immediately. And she said, so Dr. Thompson, what do I have to do to get this school to serve my son's needs? And I said, you need to find a new school. This school is not going to be able to serve your son's needs. And I've been talking about him all day. And she looked shocked. She looked aghast. But I was simply telling the truth that somebody should have told her in no uncertain terms 2.5 years earlier, right? But independent schools, in an effort to please the customer, may go down a very long road with the parent. Who is the victim of this, ultimately? Well, it's the teachers who are getting berated. That's not good. But ultimately, it's the child. And it's way too long for the child.
Yeah. And at the end, the parent isn't happy anyway. So
correct. Right, Matt. That's exactly right.
Yeah. So speaking of parents, you divide parents in the book into two camps, and they thankfully are not equal. Can you talk to us about the 95% of parents versus the 5% of parents?
Yeah, this is Michael's famous distinction.
and Rob now says it might be 90-10, but I'm sticking with look. It's a metaphor. Yes. It is not science. It's a metaphor.
Sure,
but
yeah.
I tell teachers, when Rob and I both do difficult parent workshops for teachers, and what I say is 95% of the parents are workable with additional time, more information, and particularly description of a child's functioning in the classroom. That's the great weapon, in quotes. That's the strongest thing that a teacher has in her portfolio, is describing the way the child functions in the class. Yeah. Because that parent can't see that. Yeah. And the teacher's seeing it every day, and she has multiple examples. With additional time for a meeting, with empathy, with some active listening, 95% of parents can be fully domesticated. They will eat lumps of sugar from your hand. They will walk out of your classroom thinking, darn, that's a good teacher, right? She really knows my child. And you've done the right thing. 5% of parents are not workable for reasons of their unhappy marriage, their excessive wealth, their narcissistic personality disorder. There are people in independent schools. Independent schools give all of the parents the presumption of good mental health. And that's not absolutely true. Rob and I have actually seen some really troubled people. I mean, some really troubled people in independent schools. And you have too, right? You're sure said you've seen them too. But giving really troubled people the ongoing presumption of they're going to turn the corner and get reasonable anytime is a mistake, because these are people who need limits and boundaries. And when Rob and I spoke on this at NAIS, I was putting together a little PowerPoint show, and the last slide was going to be on the advanced toolkit, which we have in the book. And I said, so what do you want, Rob, what do you want for the advanced toolkit for teachers, for dealing with the 5% of parents? What do you want on the final slide? And he said, just put limits, right? Because there are parents who are not after insight. They're not interested in learning about their child. They're interested in getting something and beating on the school until they get it. And those parents need strong limits and boundaries, and they may need them repeatedly. And that's the only thing that will save the relationship between the parents and the school, is the school standing up.
And sometimes the relationship isn't salvageable, and what you have to do is cull the herd. And occasionally what the school has to do is to say, I'm sorry, if you keep this up, your child cannot return next year. And it never has to happen often, and schools never want to do it. But Michael and I have had the experience over and over of encountering schools that have been putting up for 4 and 5 years with parents who have been literally terrorizing classroom teachers. And in fact, the school doesn't want to take it out on the student by excommunicating the family. But there are places where the school starts to lose other families because they no longer want their kids to be associated with this. And almost invariably, when they finally bite the bullet and make the decision, everybody feels better in the end. And there's no reason, just because you're an independent school, that you should be assumed that you can work with absolutely anybody, no matter what. There are inevitably going to be a very small segment of people you can't work with. And in those cases, really push comes to shove, I think, more often than not. Unfortunately, it typically happens too late. But Michael and I have never seen these kinds of parents suddenly say, oh my goodness, I never thought about that. No wonder people don't like me because I swear at them and call them names. Maybe I should change what I'm doing. It's not what you hear because we're talking here, whether it's 5% or 6%, it doesn't matter. We're talking about the far fringe of behavior. We're not talking about a close call. We're talking about a tiny minority way out on the edge.
Let me ask you a follow-up question to that. And, it's interesting. I actually read this book and I found myself in my parent mode as much as I was in my educator mode. And I think it does offer some things as a parent to think about. But in my educator mode, one of the things that I think I'm detecting in the message of the 95 versus the 5% is it's also not okay for me as a teacher to keep trying to push people into the 5% camp, right? Like I need to operate out of the assumption that most parents are going to have good intentions and as an administrator, I shouldn't encourage a culture of teachers that want to keep just pushing folks and saying that damaged people
and Matt,
damaged or everyone's an appropriate parent.
I've seen some veteran teachers who become wary and guarded and cynical, and it's not attractive. And you can hear it in their voices when they talk about parents, them, and the disdain is there. And that is a job for the administrators because somebody who's is enjoying teaching in an independent school is enjoying the well-behaved children who mostly do their homework and has contempt for the parents. There's a moral disconnection there. And an administrator needs to hold a teacher accountable for that kind of attitude. It's destructive and it has no place in a good independent school. That's the other side of the coin.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's definitely something. I mean, that's almost equally as toxic as the 5%er parents themselves when faculty begin to become toxic. So
we get to a different point here, though, Michael, which is, and this happens in schools, and just as schools often delay taking action about toxic parents, they typically delay taking action about toxic teachers. And so, the ideal is a school that would start with the benefit of the doubt for everybody, do their best to work with people, and then when folks don't come around and don't respond, would then think more seriously and more rapidly about taking action, whether it's a parent or it's a faculty member.
Yeah, it sounds from what you've been sharing that part of the work you do in situations where schools are dealing with extreme parents or extreme faculty is just helping administrators do what they probably knew they needed to do a long time ago and
Correct.
get through the mental barriers there.
That's a great way to say it. Because in fact, when you say, have you thought about this? Or if this parent, or for that matter, if this teacher came to you and said, I think we're not coming back next year, would you be urging them to stay? And they had to say, oh, no. So to me, the answer is then the question is not how do you turn them around at this point? It's how do you facilitate the departure? Because what you have to do is keep in mind, especially for the head of the school, for example, sort of the good of the school community, not just keeping every individual provider and customer happy somehow. And the other thing is to say, the need to do this is not frequent. It's not like you have to sort of exile a couple of families every year. Most schools never have to do it that frequently. And so, it's more the question of how much avoidance there is and whether it can be reduced some than really anything else.
So we all have the defects of our virtues.
Yes.
And the virtues of teachers is that they're optimistic and they believe in development. They give kids a reboot every fall. Even the kid who was just a real pain in the neck in third grade, the teachers already think, well, in fourth grade, maybe he will have grown up. Yeah. And actually, many of them do. Kids actually grow and develop. But character disordered parents do not. And giving them a summer and a chance to start again, to do the same bad stuff that they were doing the year before and the year before that, that's not reasonable. That's not sensible. And that's why Rob and I wrote this book. Psychologists are better trained in prognosis Uh, and we tend to be a little more suspicious about where this road is headed. And educators tend to be a little more optimistic, even idealistic, even delusional about where this road is headed.
No, but this is just what you want with your children. This is what teachers gives teachers absolutely. The capacity to work with kids that other people couldn't. So you don't want to lose it. But the irony is here that it's not good preparation for dealing with certain adults. That's all.
So there's a chapter in your book that I'm really glad that you included. It tackles the difficult topic of race and some of the challenges that can arise when you have a white teacher and a family that does not identify as white, or vice versa. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about the unique communication challenges that arise specifically around issues of race.
They're really about issues of trust. At bottom, it's about trust. Independent schools were founded essentially as an exclusionary enterprise. I mean, let's be honest, right? They weren't designed for a wide variety of people. They were designed for people like us, and however that's defined in any given community. So when a school becomes more diverse, the assumptions that we're all together in this, that we all see things and we all trust the school, see things in the same way and trust the school in the same way, that simply breaks down when Black parents bring a child to a school that's been a majority white school for its whole life. And their child is one of a small minority, and maybe a minority that's only grown in recent years, and they don't trust the school. And many teachers in independent schools are used to homogeneity and a kind of trust. And it's alarming to them that people might not trust them or share their assumptions. But we give ways in which teachers can ask questions of parents of color to find out what their dream was in bringing their child to a majority white school and what their fears are. Because, of course, parents of color have hopes and fears too. And it's their hope that's bringing them to the door of the independent school, but it's the sight of the independent school and the majority white population that inflames their fears. How could it not?
Yeah. So it seems like from your, the book and what you're sharing right now, that part of the strategy here is open communication and not being afraid to just name, the reality of the school's student body and the racial makeup and to just talk openly about, how people are experiencing things. I mean, does that sound accurate?
Yeah. So, if you think about it really, almost always we feel better when somebody we're dealing with names what we know is going on, because it shows that he or she is aware, first of all. And in terms of the trust that Michael just mentioned, it's easier to trust somebody who's talking straight to you somehow. So as opposed to saying, acting as though we're all really the same here, when we know we're not, for instance, that's not likely to inspire trust. And if you imagine two ends of a continuum, one at which we pretend there are no color differences, even though they're blatantly right there, and nothing that comes along with that, and the other in which we simply do nothing but exaggerate them. That's a whole big continuum. And, what the book recommends is actually that that teachers and administrators and so on be unafraid to ask about and genuinely inquire about and want to know about the experience of Black families, parents, but the book is mostly about parents, but students as well, want to know about what their experience is, what their concerns are, and without leaning into this in a heavy-handed way, do it in a frank and straightforward way that betokens, I want to know, I'd like to understand. And I think most of us, when we finally believe somebody else really does want to understand us, start to feel better and are more likely to begin a more trusting relationship with the school, than if they go through the motions of something that looks like it's all blandly fine, but we actually don't feel touched.
So the last couple of chapters of the book offer the basic toolkit and the advanced toolkit, and we don't want to spoil that for the listener because we want them to get the book.
Buy the book.
Read it. But could we ask a backward question about that? What are the things that a school should stop doing, and what is clearly not working and should be in terms?
It's a great question that nobody ever asks us, Matt. So one thing that we both think is too often schools assume that they should do with parents what they do with kids, which is teach them and explain things to them. And if they don't agree and things aren't going well, they should repeat it. And if that doesn't work, they should do it again. And that somewhere between a kind of a kindly school marmish, to use an old phrase, edge on one side or an earnest pleading on the other side. We're big believers, and there's not a whole lot of secrets about what we put in the toolkit. But for example, there's real value in asking people to tell you a little more instead of trying to explain yourself to them right away and make them see it your way. And many teachers who are gifted at doing this with students find when they get with parents, they sort of tense up and they start explaining and talking. And parent says, you gave her a C. And the teacher said, yes, I know she got a C. And the parent said, no, you gave her a C. And the teacher says, well, she got a C on that. Parent says, no, she worked hard on that paper. Sometimes the parent says, we worked hard on that paper, but you gave her this. And the teacher then says, well, let me explain my grading policy to you. Well, this is going nowhere, as opposed to something that says, can you tell me what you're so concerned about? To do some inquiry. Once again, we get back to hopes and fears. When faculty are able to do that kind of thing, which they would do with students, Matt, unhesitatingly, they have a chance to actually have parents calm down a little and be better able to listen to whatever it is the teacher has to say, even if they don't ultimately agree with it, So part of what we recommend to them actually is to put on your head the hat you would wear if you were talking to a student. It sounds condescending, but it actually isn't. And it's just one way of conceptualizing the conversation, because what doesn't really work and isn't worth continuing is repeated explanations to parents, trying to get them to see that you're right and they're wrong.
So your show's for aspiring school leaders. And it's really important that administrators not ignore this and assume that all teachers with experience will just get better and better with parents.
Yes.
And that's been the method in independent schools, right? But then you have a 30-year teacher everybody knows is terrible with parents, but nobody's trained her, right? Everybody knows that there's a disaster waiting to happen, but nobody's trained her. If you're going to be an independent school administrator, you have to set aside some time and debrief young teachers in their first or second and third year. How did your parent-teacher conferences go? Were you worried? Did you feel you mishandled something? Please tell me what went well, what didn't go well. After back-to-school nights, administrators need to pull their teachers in and say, did you get ambushed? Were there awkward moments? Let's go over that. Administrators need to help teachers to grow in this area. And more than anything, that's what Rob and I have been doing in the recent past, that is the last 20 years. And it was our motivation. It was our motivation for writing this book, because we realized we'd been in schools all these decades and we'd never seen a guide to help teachers and help teachers and administrators get better in their work with parents. That's what we tried to provide.
So one thing, Matt, that's important about it is this is not a book about how to do something to parents. Though, we have some colorful examples because there are lots of them. But seriously, this is actually a book about how to improve the relationship, but not in the usual ways. And in terms of other things not to be continuing, Matt, one of them is the bending over backwards and the constant, or the running from pillar to post. I don't know what the metaphor ought to be. And the constant effort to please, versus a kind of a willingness to deal in a way that's both calmer, more direct, more inquiring, a little more curious, interested, wanting to hear, but also needing to tell you a thing or two that would be good for you to listen to. And so we're trying to sort of change the tone, if you will, but also the kind of the whole approach, one which is actually aimed at improving the relationship and having parents feel better, but not by doing the standard stuff that schools have previously been doing to try to make that happen.
Gentlemen, Michael and Rob, thank you so much. You have provided a tremendous amount of wisdom, and we hope everyone picks up Hopes and Fears. It's a fantastic book. I'm going to read it multiple times. I can tell you that. So thank you for being on the Full Stack Educator podcast today.
Thanks for inviting.
Matt and Michael, it's a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Hopes and Fears, Working with Today's Independent School Parents, is the new book by Robert Evans and Michael Thompson we've been discussing in today's podcast. Pick up your copy today in the NAIS store. You can find it under the featured books. It's a great summer read for administrators and teachers at any independent school. You can connect with Robert Evans at robertevans.org and with Michael Thompson at michaelthompson-phd.com.
Thank you for listening to the Full Stack Educator Podcast. We hope that today's conversation helped you grow as an independent school leader. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to resources mentioned in the podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, rate it, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Episodes of this podcast are released bi-weekly. You can follow and engage with Matt McGee and Michael Amusio on LinkedIn.